welcome back to the 7th part of my Satisfactory tutorial in Unreal Engine. In this part, we're going to be going over the automated crafting, so to speak. In previous parts, we already made that, but now we're going to actually add the interface so that the player can drop from his inventory items into a crafter so that it does it itself, and as well so we can actually choose specific recipes for specific crafters. That way we can finally start automating the process. So to do that, we need to set up a few little things with the interactions first, and then we can actually get into the widgets, which will take some of the ones we made in the last part, but also some new ones. So if we go and interact with our thing here, our smelter, we don't want it to say pick up iron ore, because what it's doing is just remembering what was previously there. If we look at the crafting table, it will say open crafting table, which is not correct. So to fix that, what we want to do is we're going to open up our building. I'm also going to have to open up our smelter and our container, so both of these. Although we won't be touching the container today, we want to go to the event graph for both of these. And in buildings is where we're going to be opening the actual widget itself. So for that, in our interfaces here on the top, in the left, if you don't have your interfaces, even though you should normally, you need to go into class settings and add it right here by searching for our BPI, or in our case it won't appear, but it's BPI interact, which is the one we're using. So we want to double click on our overlap interaction, and this is the one where we get to say interact text, and we can actually change it right here. Now, this is the default class, so it doesn't actually do anything, so there's no real point of modifying it here. So we're just going to copy this, place it in container, because it's a child, so it uses the same interfaces right here, and we're going to say open container. And then we'll copy it again, and in smelter we'll do the same thing, and we'll say open smelter. So now we have the proper keywords for interacting. So if we go and look at this, we still get our coal, we still get our iron, but if we look here, we get container, and if we look here, we get smelter. So the next step is we want to actually make our interaction start. So for the interaction to start, we need to first make some widgets. Otherwise, we can't actually set this up because it won't work. So to do that, we want to go back to our A buildings. We're going to do most of this in the base class, and if it's for the container, because the container will be a bit different from the smelter. Because the smelter, let's say we have a smelter, a constructor, a manufacturer, an assembler. All of those will use the same widget because it's all crafting at the end of the day. But for the container, it needs to just be an inventory, right? So for that case, we'll just override it by calling our interact with right here directly. That way we don't have to deal with the one that we have in our parent. We just have our new one right here. So for now, we'll delete that. We won't be doing that today. So we can close our smelter as well. We won't be needing that either. And in our A buildings, we want to select interact with actor. And this is going to be, well, just a test. If we print and we go and click right here and press E, we have hello because we're trying to interact. Now we can't interact yet because we don't have anything to do. So to interact, we want to have a widget. So for that widget, what we're going to do is we're going to need to make it. So the first widget we're going to make is exactly the kind of main menu widget, we'll call it. So it's going to be UMG underscore buildings craft. Okay. Or you can call it buildings widget, whatever's fine. Maybe actually just buildings UMG will do the... No, it won't. Because some other ones might not have a crafting system. So we're just going to go in here and make a few variables and a few events that we're going to expose. That way we can set all that up and we don't have to come back to our buildings once that's done. Although I think there's a bit of back and forth, but we'll see. So the first thing we're going to need is we need to know what the inventory is, because we need the inventory to know, well, what are we talking about? What's visually being shown? Or what is in our current inventory that we need to show, because we're going to be using a system like we did in the normal inventory where we can see what we have on the right side. So we'll call this as AC inventory, and it's going to be of type AC inventory as well. Then we need a reference to the building itself. So this is just going to be building, and it's going to be of type A underscore buildings. There we go, the first one. We want both of these to be exposed on spawn and obviously instance editable, or they won't be visible. And now we want to make just two quick interfaces. So I'm just going to check that I get these correct. So the first one we want to know, or the first event, is we want to know what recipe is selected. So we want to call an event for recipe selected. Now, this just needs a parameter, and that's going to be the actual recipe itself. So DA recipe right here. And we'll just call that recipe. The next one we want to know is we want to know when we close the widget. So close widget right here, and this one doesn't need any inputs. It's fine as is. So with that done, we can go back to our buildings, I believe, and we can actually finish setting this up right now. So the first thing we want to do is we need to know what's interacting. So to do that, we want to create a variable here, unless I already made it. No, we didn't. So we want to promote this to a variable, which we will be calling interacting player. And there we go. And once we're done here, we can say we want to check whether our new UMG we're making actually exists. So before doing that, we'll make the UMG. That way it's easier. So we search for create widget, and the widget we're looking for is our UMG building craft. And so from here, we want to promote this to a variable, which we'll be calling our UMG building. So there we go. So we can plug this in. Well, actually, no. First, we want to get our building here, and we want to convert to validated. This way, we only create a new one if we don't already have one visible. So for our AC inventory, we need our inventory, and we will say get AC inventory, which is a component of the player character. Line these up, and we'll just use self for the building. There we go, line both of these a bit closer. There we go. The next thing we need to do is we need to quickly make events for binding. So for that, we want to drag from our building here, search for bind event recipe selected. We'll start with that one. We want to create it, and normally we already have one here because that's the whole point. We have something already made, and it's called change recipe. And the reason we want to do this is because we want to call, when we call this event inside of here, meaning once we click on our actual widget, we want to use the system we had already set up in here, which I believe is on spawn here, where we change our recipe. And so now we actually get to, well, tell it which recipe that is, thanks to our event dispatcher here. Next in buildings is we want to close the widget. So assign, assign does work. We just don't want the extra one there. And we're just going to actually create, we do want to use that very simply. And this we'll just leave exactly this. And we're going to move it here for a second. Now, what we can do is we'll just say create event, and we'll get our new widget that our new custom event that we just made. So plug that in. And with this, we can now finally add to viewport and connect this right there. Now, the next thing we need is we want to make sure our player character can't move anymore. So we're going to get player controller, and we're going to say set input mode game and UI only, or game and UI, not only. And we want to set mouse cursor visible. So set show, mouse cursor. And check, make sure that it's visible. Finally, the last thing we can do is with our player character, we want to get movement or character movement, and we want to call disable movement. And this will stop the player from moving. Even if he presses WASD or spacebar, he won't be able to move. And now on the other hand, when we close, we're going to do the opposite of all this. We're going to clear our UMG building by just placing it here as an empty set. Then we're going to get a reference to our controller again, and we're going to set to game only this time. And we'll be taking our show cursor and making it hidden this time. So if we go and line that up, there we go. And to finish, we want our character to be able to move again. So this time we want to say set movement mode from none back to walking. Because for those who don't know, that's what this does. It sets the movement to none. It doesn't actually have an enable. There is no enable function. You just have to set movement mode to walking again. So with this, we have our widget. So we can try by going and interacting with our smelter. Now, nothing happens because there's nothing visual yet, but if we press our keys, nothing happens. We have no way to exit it right now, but we'll be setting that up in a second. So let's get into the actual widget itself now. So inside of buildings craft, we're gonna have to make a few extra smaller widgets, but we're gonna start by making the whole thing, the thing as a whole, because it's actually quite big. There's quite a few things to go through. So we're gonna have to make those, we'll go through them slowly. I'll maybe try and make the main outline and then we'll go through part by part. So first we wanna just add another canvas panel. The first one is just the canvas panel, which is 1920 by 1080. And then we wanna add a second one, which is going to be the center. So this one we want to place in the middle, and we'll put its alignment to 0.5, 0.5 and 0.5, and 0, 0 obviously here. There we go. And I believe, how big are we gonna make it? We'll put it by 1300 by 800. Now obviously this is whatever you want, it's just visual, so it's not a problem if you want to change that. We want to have two backgrounds, or we want to kind of divide this into multiple parts. The first part is going to be kind of a title of sorts, let's say. So we're going to make sure this is spread at the top, so fill on the top, and so put it on 0 on the right. And I think height we'll just leave it at 60 because we want it to be still rather big. And we'll make it a bit of a kind of lightish gray. Then we want to actually add here, we're going to add our button to close. So we're going to add a button here. It's going to go right under it. This is probably actually better. We'll put this in a canvas panel, I think. It'll be probably a bit easier to manage that way. So drop it all in the canvas panel, and we'll align the canvas panel just like we did for the actual image. So 0 and 60. And the image by itself will make it fill, and the button will just simply be in the top right, but we'll make it fill because either way it's going to hit the bottom as well. So we want to put it at 1 on the X, and then we can put it at 0 and it will appear right here. Leave it at 100 or that'll be just fine. We want to change the background color to red because that's what it's for. It's going to be the button to close the widget. Compile and save. So if you want, we can just quickly set that up. We want to get our button closed here. Unclicked. We're going to say close widget right here, call it, and that'll do the trick for simply opening and closing the widget now. Let's try. Interact, press cross, and it didn't... Wait, I think I forgot something. Yeah, sorry, no. This works. We just also need to then say remove from parent because we don't actually do that in our event dispatcher here. So we just do it from within because that works just fine. So if we go and press E, close it, we can go again, in and out, no problem. So the interaction works just fine now. So let's get on to the actual rest. So the first thing we want is when you're going to need 2 more buttons. One button right here. Both of them are going to be in our canvas panel, and we're going to be using them to switch between what we're selecting as a recipe and what's actually being crafted. So to do that, we want our text in here because we want to know which button is which. So this is also going to be filled on the left side. So 0, and the text we will put to select recipe. And then we can just make this a bit bigger so that it fits. So let's say 230. We'll then duplicate this button. So I'm actually going to rename this to select. And the next one we'll rename it to production is what we'll call it. That's what we're going to put inside as well. So call this production. And we can just move this, I think, well, we'll just move it 230 on the X, and it'll appear next to it. So with this, we finished kind of our top bar. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use a widget switcher. We want to place it in our original canvas panel, so the center one, not the whole one. It'll appear like this normally if we collapse our canvas panel right here. And we want it to be 60 on the Y because we want it to be below, and we want it to then fill kind of the rest. So we'll just put it as fill as a whole and just leave it 60 off the top. So like this, it should look. And so with this, we now have a means to go between 2 panels just by clicking a button. So just to give an example, we'll make 2 backgrounds. So we'll start with a canvas for both either way. So this will be our select, we'll call it. And then we'll have another one which we'll be calling our production. Now for select, we'll just add an image for now. And that image will be, let's just make it so it shouldn't be appearing. No, sorry, I made a mistake. They need to be under there, sorry. Make the image a part of it, otherwise it will consider it separate. And so we'll leave this image there normal, and we'll make it in production, we'll make it blue. So when you're editing, when you click on another one, it'll automatically switch across. If I click on select, it'll be the white one. If I click on production, it'll be blue. So now let's make it so that we actually switch. So to switch, you need to change this value here, which is called the active widget index, which is very simple. This is index 0, this is index 1. So all we have to do is we have our buttons for production, so on clicked, and our button on select clicked. We simply want to tell it which active widget we want to use. So we get our widget switcher and we say set active widget index. And you can also do this directly by selecting which widget you want to actually be visible, but we don't want to do that. We just simply want to use the index itself. So with this, we can then say for production, we want it to be 1, and for the select, we want it to be 0. So now by default, it will be 0. If we go and interact now, we press E. If we select, we're already on 0, so nothing changes. If we click on production, it becomes blue, and obviously vice versa. If we swap between the two, same thing happens. So next up is actually what's going to be in each part. What are we going to add for each specific part? So we'll start with the recipe selection. So we'll get rid of our actual image here. It's not necessary. Neither is this. Well, actually, we'll leave them for now so we know that we're switching correctly, even though it should be working just fine. So the first thing we need in our recipe selection is we want a scroll box. Now, the reason we want a scroll box is we want to be able to tell how many, we want to scroll through every item we have, every recipe we have, to be more precise. So we want the scroll box to be top left corner. We'll make it, I think 1000 is a bit much. I think 800 will do. And we want to make it, I believe, we'll just go fill, I think, for the bottom. So we'll just do this. So 0 here. There we go. And so the scroll box itself doesn't do anything. We don't need to actually reference it at all. What we want to add is also, we want to add a grid. And we're not using our grid, we're just using the uniform grid this time inside of here. And what it will do is, as we add items or add recipes that exist, they will be appearing here. And we'll then be able to select them by clicking. So we don't have a widget for that, but we'll be doing that once once we've done everything in the setup, let's say, for this area. So this is all we need for the actual showing which recipes are available, at least on the designer side, not the code side. That still needs to be done. But we want to add something else. We want to make it so that if we hover over a specific widget or a specific recipe, we know what it is, how much energy it needs, how much time it requires to craft, what resource it needs. So that's what we're going to add here on the right side. So we'll add another canvas panel and make sure that it is within the select one. Otherwise it will make another widget here, which we don't want. And so this canvas panel, we actually want to make it variable, and we're going to give it a name. So CP recipe detail, we'll call it. And the reason for this is if we don't select anything, we don't want it to show anything. So it's just easier to just hide everything. So this is going to actually be on the right side here. We're going to focus it over here. We're going to make it 1 on the X and 0, so that way it's on this side. And I think it'll have to be 400 in size or 500. And obviously 0 at the bottom, so that it reaches the bottom. Within here, we have a few things we need to do. And so what we want is information. So the first thing we want is we want to know what name this is. So this is going to be centered. We want to center the text. And we'll put it 0.5 on the X and I'll do just fine. So this is going to be textbox underscore name. And the information it will be giving us is the name of the item that we're going to craft. Then we want an image. So we're going to get another image or image right here and place in here. And this is going to be visually what we're going to make. So image, and this is going to be called icon, we'll say. Once again, center. 0.5 on the X, 0, and we'll say 150 I think is good, and we'll say, I think 150 is maybe a bit small, so we'll say 200 by 200. There we go. So this looks just fine. Next up is we can add some extra information. It all depends really what we have in our actual crafting right here in our recipe. So in our recipe we have name, duration, inputs, and the hammer. Now the hammer isn't very useful here. We just want to know the inputs, outputs, duration. So what we can do is we can do exactly that. So we're going to add something we'll add just text here. And this text will contain stats, we'll call it. So 0.5 once again to center it. And this one we don't need to set as variable because it's just a title. And that title is stats. Make sure we center it as well. And below it, so I'm just copy pasting here, we want another text box, and this one contains the duration. And so just to make it clear how this is going to work, we're going to be formatting a duration, and we're then going to be putting it in seconds. So this is kind of what it will look like when we format the text itself. We'll make it light so that it's different from above, and we'll center it by putting it at 0 there. We can also make it a bit smaller, putting it at 18. There we go. Next thing we're going to need is we want to know the cost of what we're making, because we don't need to know the outputs because the recipe is kind of the output itself, right? So we want to get another piece of text. So we'll actually just copy our stats here again and center it, and both of them are centered, yeah. So, and this one is going to be called cost. And so this is what we need to input to get the result we want. So what we need is we're going to need a horizontal box which will store all this information. So the horizontal box, we can also once again center it, and I believe I put, just to keep the same values here, well that doesn't matter really, that can be 0, that's fine. So 0 here, I think 270 here will do, and 60 on the height. That way we have enough for 4 items, because I don't think there's ever more than 4. If you want more, you need to have more space, that's fine. But in our case, we'll stick to 4 max visually. So with that, we've now finished setting up our basis for the selection of a recipe. So what we can do now is go through the different steps that we need to make it actually work. Because currently, if we just go ahead and play, we get our recipe selection, right? We get everything there, that's not a problem, but there's nothing to actually do. So we're going to go and set that up now. So the first thing we need to do for that is we need another widget. And that widget is going to be called, I think we're going to be calling it recipe, or in my case, I'm going to be calling it Recipe Auto. So back in our blueprints, our widgets, we want to call this UMG, once we've selected that, UMG Recipe Auto. This is just to differentiate from the actual just basic recipe here, just that we know that it's for specifically this. So Recipe Auto is rather simple. We're going to take a size box right here. And for the size box, obviously it depends what you want. But in my case, I want it to be similar to Satisfactory. So it's going to be 150 by 200. And we can change this to custom, sorry, not custom, desired, which will give us this result. So it's kind of like a rectangle, the style we want. So then we can add a canvas panel, like in every single widget we make. We want an image first as a background, and this image is going to be used to inform us whether we've selected the item or not. So if, just like how it went orange in our manual crafting system once we selected it, the same thing will be here. So we set it to fill, and we fill it up, and in our case we're going to use once again the same kind of orange. I think this one's a bit bright. There we go. Maybe a bit less. Let's see what we can get. There we go. Also, if anybody is wondering, this is a neat trick. If you have a color that you like and you want to save it, you can drag it up here, and you can actually make different libraries for your specific colors. Now, these don't go across projects, but it's very useful within one project if you need it. So we want to make this like this, and then what we'll do is we'll also make sure that, for now at least, actually, sorry, no, I'm getting this wrong. So we do want to do this, but for now we actually want to make it hidden. So we don't want it to be visible. So not there, we want to actually change this in here. So in the color opacity, sorry, I got that wrong. We want to make sure that it's visible like this. Next, we want another image, and this image is going to be our actual icon. So for this, sorry, for the background, we want to rename it as well, just so it's clear what it is. This is the image background. There we go. Then we have this one, which is going to be the image icon. And next we have, I don't think we have another image. I think I'm getting ahead of myself here. Yeah, so no, we don't. So we then have our button, which is going to be the actual selection. So this needs to be fill as well, but it's going to be invisible because we don't want to see it. We just want to know that it's there, so that we click on it, we know. We actually need to, I'm getting ahead of myself again. We want to make the icon centered, and we actually want to give it a specific size. So 0, and we can put it down, I think, about 50, and we'll make it 100 by 100 this time. So maybe 50 is too much. 20 should be good. And we can test it by putting an iron ingot, for instance, and seeing what that looks like. Then we want to add a text box, which we're going to put below, and this is going to be scaled to the bottom here. So 0 and 0. I'm actually going to put 1 on the Y side, it's a bit above, and we can raise it a little bit, I think. Something like 60 will do. And to make sure this widget doesn't get too big, or the text doesn't go outside, we're going to wrap it with a scale box. If I'm correct, I'm just making sure. And we'll leave the scale box exactly as it is. We don't need to change much there. What we want to do is we want to change our text box here so that it actually wraps itself. So go down to wrapping and say auto wrap text. And we also want to make it a bit smaller because currently it's a bit too big of a font. So just change the bold to light and put something like 16 will do. We can then also put it to the top. It's a bit easier to read, and fill, I think will do. And so it changes size naturally because that's how the scale box works. If it has the space, it will make itself bigger. So we can compile and save. This does it for visually. We actually, no, one last thing, we need to make sure that our text box is variable. So tb name, and this time it's recipe name. So make sure you're aware of that. So we can now go to our graph right here, and we can start setting up what this logic does, because this is very simple. We won't need to do much as far as this goes. We're going to need one function. There's going to be a function we'll call deselect. And then we're going to need a few event dispatchers, not local variables, event dispatchers, which we're going to be calling new recipe selected. We want another one called hovered recipe, and another one called unhovered recipe. How it works in our craft here, this should only appear once we hover a widget, once we hover a recipe. It doesn't work when we click on it, because when we click on it, we want to automatically go to production. We want to be on the page where we see everything working. So this only shows when you actually hover it. So that's why in our order recipe, we want to use the hover instead of the select. So for the select, we want to use this. We want to know what UMG we selected. So UMG recipe, and we're looking for auto. So for some reason, sorry, we'll just retype that, auto. And it's all the way at the bottom. Select the object. And for these two, instead, we want to actually select our recipe itself. So DA recipe. And in both cases, we'll use the same thing and just call it recipe for both of them. There we go. And we can compile and save. So for the deselect, we'll just do that very quickly. For deselect, what we want to do is we want a variable called selected, and that's simply going to be set to false right here. That's all. But we also want to change our background and set its color and opacity to be something slightly different. And by slightly different, we mean we want it to be invisible now. We want it to go back to how it was initially because we're no longer selecting this item. Now we can go to our event graph where everything else kind of happens. So the first thing we need is we're going to be using our event construct only. So from our event construct, we want to get data assets, or we're going to need a data asset. We don't have one yet, now that I think about it. We're going to need a variable of type, well, DA recipe. So call this data asset or call it recipe, doesn't really matter. And call it DA of type, DA recipe. So from our DA recipe, we actually need this one to be exposed on spawn. And we need one other variable here, which is going to be the size override. So right here, because we need this in case we try and change something. So this is a 2D vector right here. Make sure it's exposed on spawn as well, right here. So one other thing I just forgot is we also need to make sure our size box here is variable. Otherwise we can't use our override. So what we want to do with our data asset now, we want to say get output, or actually, yeah. So here we're going to use, in our case, up until now, and I think that's always going to be the case, we're only going to have one output. So even if we have it as an array, we're just going to get the first one anyway. So get a copy. Want to split this right here, and we want to get our image from here because the output is the image that we need. So we're going to then set brush, oh sorry, no, we need to reference our image first. Set brush from texture. Plug this in here, plug the texture into the image, and line that up. With the data, we can also reroute here and get the, get name. There we go. And with the name, we can set that to our other text box that we have here. Set text right here. Plug this in. There we go. And the last thing we need to do is what we'll do with our size override here. We will check whether it is different from 0, 0. And if it is, that means we want to change it. If not, we'll just leave it as it is, because if we override it to 0, 0, it's not visible anyway. So if it is, we want to get our size box and say set width override and set height override. Plug these both in right here on true. Get size and size override, sorry. Plug it into the X, plug it into the Y. And we are done with our start. So the next thing, or the last things we need to do, is we actually need to do our clicking. So if a recipe is clicked on, so with our button right here, we want to tell it that we have selected that recipe. So that means we go here, we call our selected recipe, we get self this time because it's using an actual reference to the UMG and not a reference to our data asset. We then say selected becomes true because we're selecting this recipe. And we can say that our background, our color opacity of it, becomes that orange that we selected earlier. So click that right here. And that means that this recipe will be selected because when we switch between the widget switcher, it doesn't actually delete them. So it will keep this color so we know which one is selected at all times. Next in button, we want to do on hovered and obviously on unhovered. And we'll be using obviously our data asset here and our call from our event dispatchers. We go like this. And the same for our unhovered, call and attach it right there. So line this up. There we go. Now one last thing we need to do is if we're not selected, we want to actually change and show that we're actually hovering the item. So grab this right here. In both cases, we're doing the same thing. If we unhover, we want to change the visibility to be back to 0. And remember, this is only being called when we're not already selected it. So if it's orange, we don't actually want to update it. We just want it to be aware that it's been selected. Now, if it is not selected and we hover it, then we want it to be white again, I think, or do we want it to be, no, we want it to be black, and we'll make it slightly visible. So something like 0.4 will do. I just realized this one right here didn't get completely blanked out. There we go. And we can compile and save. Now, just to test if this is working, if the hovering is working correctly, we can go and get a UMG Recipe Auto and just place it in here for now. And so normally if we go and select it by going and interacting, we should get, yeah, so it's hovering correctly just as we want. Now the size isn't correct, but we'll get to that in a second. We'll get an error because we haven't told it which data type to be, but that's fine. We'll deal with that in a second. So I'm just going to check that I've set them up correctly as far as the actual scroll box goes and the grid. I think they're all good. So now it's just a matter of telling them what recipes we're talking about. So we can go ahead and delete this again. Don't need it. We're going to be adding them now directly, or more like automatically with the code. Okay, so what we're going to be doing is the same trick that we did to get our list of recipes right here. So to do that, we're just going to actually go ahead and copy it from there because it's the same thing. In our event graph, we should have normally add all recipes right here. We have a function that goes through and gets all our crafting recipes and adds them to an array. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to copy this bit right here, which just gets the assets, because obviously it's not the same widgets that we're going to be making. So we need to use this one. So we can actually, in our craft, our buildings right here, we can just place it. Then we can just close our crafting table for now. And right here, we'll start with a sequence because we need to do some other things as well. And on the second part, we will add our assets for now. So just line this up correctly. And there we go. So with our for each loop, what we want to do is we're going to cast to DA recipe, because obviously we could have actually copied that. I'm a bit stupid, I forgot that. We want to go and create widget, and this is going to be our new widget that we just made. So we're looking for Recipe Auto right here, DA asset right there. We don't want to override this, no problem. Yeah, so in our UMG grid, so this is in our actual inventory, I made a function that's actually quite useful. So what it does, no, not this one, sorry, wrong one. In our inventory grid, there's a macro here that allows us to determine pretty much based on how many rows, how many items we can have per row and the current child, where it should be placed in a grid-like state. So we can just copy this because we'll be using it here as well. Just copy paste, it should be very simple, shouldn't have any errors at all. Close that, and we're going to be using it right here. So what we need is with our grid here, we're going to be getting our recipe, sorry, not our, where is it? So we need to actually have it visible. Sorry, that's my bad. Our uniform grid here needs to be visible. So we'll just call this recipe grid. And we'll be getting that recipe grid right here. We will be getting children count and placing this into right there. Now for the max row, we want 3. And now we can actually start to set this up. So with our grid again, we want to say add child to uniform grid. Make sure you put the uniform grid or you won't have this. And the item or the content is going to be the return value here, rows and columns. And there we go. So here what we want to do is we want to reroute this because we need to bind some functions. So we actually need to do a few other ones as well, but for now this will be fine. So what we want to do is we want this, and we're going to say bind event for, let me just double check. We want to bind the event new recipe selected to a function that we're going to make here for new recipe selected. So we're going to create an event, and we're actually going to have to select create matching function, which is going to be called, well, actually, we can't call it directly. We need to rename it new recipe selected as well. There we go. So back in our event graph, we then want to add the other functions. So for now, they won't do anything, but we're just going to set them up anyway. Reroute bind event hovered. And this is going to be for modifying our actual block here. So we want to also create an event for that. So create event matching function. This will be hover recipe. And we can just duplicate it for unhover because it uses the exact same thing. Compile and save. And back in our event graph, we need to do the same thing. So reroute again, and this time for unhover. Bind unhover event. And we can just copy this and just change it to unhover. There we go. So with this, normally, if we go and play, and we go and interact with our actual smelter, we should have our 3 items. So we do have our 3 items, but there's a bit of a glitch here for some reason. Okay, so apparently, for some reason, unless we set this to be horizontally aligned to the center, we get that weird glitch. So I'm not exactly sure why that is. We can also, align the text. We should have done that before. That's my bad. If we play now, we have our icons appearing as we want. We can hover them, no problem. So now let's make it so that when we select them, we get to actually see what they require, what the inputs are, what the costs are, what the duration is, etc. Okay, so let's start with our hover and unhover, because new recipe selected is rather long and I don't think we can do it right yet. So if we hover, so actually one thing first, we want to select our whole canvas panel here and make it hidden. We don't want it to be visible from the start. We want to make it only visible once we hover it. So now it's invisible at the start. So now we can say, well, if we hover it, to set its visibility to, well, not hit testable, self only. Doesn't really matter too much, but no, we'll just make it visible. Sorry, we'll just make it visible. Keep it simple. So next what we want to actually do is we're going to make a quick function, or we're not going to make the function right yet. We want to say that on unhover, we want to make it visible, hidden. And so with this, we know what our recipe is. So we can say get recipe, And we can then say to update our actual widget. So this only needs to be done actually in hover, sorry. We can actually update it. This is where we're actually going to be changing all our variables here. So what we want to do is, I actually want to check something because we have so many images for some reason. So this doesn't need to be checked. We don't need many of them. So we don't need this one to be visible. That's fine. This text doesn't need to be, that one neither. Fine, it's hidden, good. This image we don't need at all either. And the same thing I think here, yeah. So they're both set. We're going to be getting rid of those anyway. So with our recipe, we want to get duration. We're going to clamp it by snapping it to a grid. Sorry, not clamping, that's the wrong word. We're going to be snapping it to a grid so that it's always at 0.1 in precision. And we're then going to be formatting this into our text. So with our text block, do we have a text box for that? We don't. So see right here, we're on the wrong one. If we select our image here, we appear right here. So this needs to be visible, or is variable, sorry. And the same thing also for our horizontal box here. It's all box, and this will call inputs. Make sure it's variable as well. And so right here, we want to set this, sorry, no, we want to get our text box right here. We want to say set text like this. We then want to format our text. Line this all up, move it a bit closer. And the format we're using is simply, sorry, like this. We'll say T for time and then second for seconds. Plug this in, and now we have our time once we select our widget. But we still have a few more things to do with our data asset here, or our recipe. We need to set our name. So we're going to get our output again. Actually, do we have a name for the recipe itself? So we do. We can just do that instead. So with our name here, sorry, we're going to be... Why is that not visible? We should have made that visible. We didn't make it variable, so we'll make it variable. Set text right here. Plug in our name very simply. Plug it into here. And we still do need the outputs though, so don't get rid of those just yet. With the outputs, we want to once again get a copy to the first one. We want to split this and we want to get image, which is going to be our icon, and plug this in right here to our image icon right here. Set by texture, set brush from texture like this. Plug it in, and the last thing we need is we want to clear our horizontal box here, because if there are items in it, we need to get rid of them. So we clear the children from it. And we can then do from our data assets, our recipe, we once again get our outputs, our inputs this time, sorry, our inputs. And we want to say for each loop, I think we already have the widget for this. I'm just gonna have to double check. So we'll see. I'm just gonna create it here, create widget, and we're looking for crafting item. So we do already have it, perfect. Now for this one, we want to specifically make sure you do exactly like me, otherwise it won't work with how we set it up before. So we want to split our structure on this side as well. And we want the quantity going to crafting quantity and the item data to the item data. We want to make sure we leave crafting quantity at 0. We want to set the size to 60 by 60 because that's what we designed it for. And we then want to add this to our input. So add child to horizontal box. And this will go into content right here. And then from content, we'll actually make some changes so that it appears nicely. So we want to set horizontal alignment to center. We want to set, vertical, don't know why I'm copying that, vertical alignment to center as well. And then we want to set the size, I think it's called, set size. And split this, and the size we want is to leave it by default. Now, I'm not sure if this is necessary, but we'll just leave it there in case. So now normally if we go and play and do our smelter here, we have the information appearing. So an iron ingot requires 1 iron ore and it takes 2 seconds. A steel ingot needs 3 of, well, normally it's 3 of each, but I think our recipe says 1. So it's very efficient steel ingot. And then we have a steel beam, which needs 4 steel ingots to be made. And also, I think all of them are all set to 2 seconds, or either that or the duration isn't working correctly. So let's see if the crafting is set up correctly. So a steel beam, 2 seconds. Let's put 5 just to see if this is working correctly. Play, interact, and steel beam is now 5 seconds. So it is working just as we want. If we click, nothing happens yet because it should be calling our actual... Let's see if it's actually calling it. So normally if we click, we should be getting our function new recipe selected. So let's see. If we go and print, we should get our recipe selected. So yep, indeed it is. It's not deselecting, which is what we're going to do in a second. So let's go and actually do as much as we can here, and then we'll move on to actually, well, normally everything should be doable, if I'm not wrong. We might need to make some functions, but everything should be okay. So first thing we want to do, put a sequence. Now, with the sequence, we're going to do the end first, which is very simple. We just want to say, well, if we selected a valid recipe, then we want to set active widget index to 1. We want to go over to being actually in the crafting part. And then we can also call our recipe selected here, like this. And we can get this item right here. And we want to get our data asset from it. And the reason we need to do this way is because we need to save information about which UMG is selected, because it's changed, or we changed its color. So we need to know which one was previously selected to change it back to normal, which is why we have the deselect function. So let's get into that. So for this to actually work, we need to promote this to a variable that we're going to save in this widget. And that variable will be called selected, not a local one, sorry. Make sure you create a normal variable. Selected recipe. And so selected recipe, sorry, that's wrong. We can't do that. So we want to make sure we promote this like this. Yeah, so that sometimes causes an issue. So we create our new function variable called selected recipe. And by doing that, it kind of bugs this out. If we compile, we get an error. But we just need to replace this with our this again. It's just that this is a specific keyword that causes some issues, so we probably shouldn't be using it, to be fair. But it doesn't matter. For now, it's okay. So convert this to validated get right here. And if it is, then we want to deselect this recipe. And we can move on. So what this will do is now, if we go and play just like this, now it won't work straight away because we still need to set this here to this. But now if we go and play and we select one recipe, we go to production and we still have this selected. But if I select a new one, we go also back to production, but it changes and it resets the other one. We can still hover just like before, but visually it doesn't change unless it's not selected. So now we need to do a bit more. We need to tell it what to do with our actual production. So currently we don't have much of that. So let's actually go forward here. We can't actually do anything else. For now, we're going to actually leave this as it is, because until we've finished with the next part, which is our actual production widget, we can't do the rest because there's nothing to actually update. So we're going to do that first and make all of that, and then we'll see what we do. But before doing that, I just want to quickly tidy everything up here to make it so that it's more readable. Now we can move on to making the other side of this system. And so that is the actual crafting side. So one thing we can do in the crafting side, which we didn't do last time, and it's probably pretty bad, we should have done that in the production part before. Well, not in the production part, sorry. We're going to make another widget here. So go into our blueprint and our widget, and we're going to create a widget which we're going to be kind of using in 2 areas, which is going to be called UMG all items. Now, what this widget is it is this. We're going to be making this in an actual widget of its own because it actually needs to be used in multiple places. So it's kind of like a function, and we should have done that to start with. So we're going to do that as quickly as possible. It really isn't that long because most of it can just be straight up copied from the other widget. So what we want to do is we're going to open our crafting table right here. We're going to select our all items, copy them, and just paste them right here. Now, currently it looks a bit off because yeah, it's stretched, but if we tell it to be a custom size, which is going to be 320 by, let's say, 660, not 6,000. There we go. We get something that's more what we had before. Now, currently this is kind of the result we get, but if we go and let's say in our crafting right here and we say all items, we can just set that ourselves and it will work just fine. We say it's 320 by 660 and it's back to normal size. So we need to do some logic here first, and then we'll move on very quickly because there's not much to do. So what we want is we want recipe selected. Now, for that, we need a few variables, or at least one specific variable, and that variable is the player. So the player inventory. So we want to call it AC inventory, and it's going to be of type AC inventory as well. And we want to make sure this is exposed on spawn, I believe. Yeah, so it does. I don't think it needs to be exposed on spawn because we actually are going to be setting it up anyway. And because most of this can't be run on the direct construct here, and the reason for that is very simple, is because how construct works is once it spawns, it does it. It's the first thing that gets called in any scenario. So if we were to do it like this here, where we just placed our all items here, it would do it immediately on spawn, but it wouldn't have a reference to this. So we're going to make a custom function, which we're going to be calling, well, just custom function, and we will call it CE construct, or late construct is probably a better idea. It's going to be called late construct, and very simply, what it's going to do is it's going to do whatever we originally had in our previous one. So right in here, in our crafting table, if we go to our event graph, we had this. And so we're going to be doing the exact same thing, but we're going to be doing it here. And the reason we call it AC inventory is that it's the same, so we can copy paste it with more ease. And then we just have to do the same thing. I think there's one last function we need, is we're going to go from here, and we're actually going to, which probably something I should have done before, is we're going to turn this into a function. So inside of our inventory grid here, so I'm actually going to open that up for a second. In our inventory grid, we're going to make that into a function. So let me just close everything up here. There we go. So what we want to do is we just make a copy of, not this, but copy this right here, all of this for now, and place an inventory grid into a function, which we will call create all grid items. Plug this in here. Now you're going to get an error because it doesn't know what the actual information is here, but we get to plug that in here, and now we have our actual grid, and self is the grid, so we don't need to worry about that. So this will do. We can now close this. We can get from our grid here, create all grid items, and we just need to get a reference to our map here from, let me see. So once again, sorry, we'll be doing the same thing I think we did here. We'll be copying this and pasting this here. It's just a basic reference to the inventory. And the target map is our inventory right here. So just drag that in, plug it in there. And we've done the basics, sorry. Now with our grid, we need to set up our items removed and items added. Sorry, our items removed and items added. And obviously, if our inventory changes, so right here, we're going to say remove the key. Just like if it's exactly the same that we did here. Right here, we did the exact same thing, no difference. And the only difference is here, we also want to let it know that our inventory has been modified with an event dispatcher. Because if we have a check right here, we don't do anything, but in some cases, especially now, we're going to need to know what has changed. So we want to add an item here, like this. And then we just want to have a basic event dispatcher. It doesn't need to have any inputs, which we'll call inventory modified. And we get to call this right here for both of them. There we go. And so with this, we are done. We no longer need to set anything else up. All we need to do now is place it in here, or more like place it correctly in here because you already have it. So back in our building craft, we can now set this to the top left corner, place it at 1 on the X, that way it aligns perfectly. Now 660 is a bit short, but it doesn't matter, it's fine, this will do. And normally, if everything is done correctly now, all we have to do in our graph, in our event graph right here on our begin play, we want to get a reference to our all items, and we want to say set inventory to our inventory right here. Align these two up, and then from our all items, we can say late construct like this and plug it in. There we go. So now if we go and play, currently if we press tab, we have no items. Let's just pick up a few. We have 3 items now. If we go and open the smelter and go into production, we have our 3 items. No problem there. So that's what we want to do. Now that we have our items, we can start doing the rest. So if we select recipe, we get moved over. It's all there as well. Next up is the actual interaction itself. Let's say the actual visual part. Currently, we don't have anything else but which items we have. Now we want to see which items we can make. So let's just remove our 2 extra images here, because now we have actual interfaces or actual widgets inside, so we know which side we're on. So we need to do this in a few parts. Once again, there's going to be some text, and this text is going to be, well, actually, to be fair, we'll make this another canvas panel. It'll be more readable if we do it that way. So we can put this to, I think, about 980 apparently, and we'll leave it about halfway. So I think 450 will do here. Yeah, maybe even 400 is okay. Not 0, 400. So within here, we want to have a text for which recipe we're dealing with. So we're going to center that, and we'll say recipe, center this text, put it in alignment to 0.5, 0 here, and we'll put it at 10. So this will be the recipe. We're not going to be using it. Doesn't need to be variable. But then under, we're going to have the actual name itself. So this will be text box recipe. And this will be is variable. We want it to be light and obviously centered as well. 0.5 here as well, and aligned the center. There we go. And that'll do it for this. Next, we want our 3 different parts. So first, we want another canvas panel here. And this canvas panel is going to be the center. It's going to be aligned, well, actually aligned right here, perfectly in the center, sorry. So 0.5 on both X and Y, 0, 0, and we're going to make it about, I think, let's see, about 220, I think we'll do, and 300 here, but actually I think it needs to be offset a bit, yeah. So we actually place this on the top, and we will say 0 here and 60 from the top, I think. No, so 80 from the top we'll have to do, and 310 or 320 actually here will do. Okay, so what this one will contain is it will contain an image, a progress bar, and let's say, and the duration it should take. So let's start with the image. First, we want to know what object we are trying to make. So we'll center this as well. And I think 150 by 150 will do here. And this time we'll use the steel beam for the image. So 0 here, and let's put 15, maybe 20, so it's a bit down. We'll call this image icon. That actually already exists, we can't do that. Image crafting icon. There we go. Compile and save. And next up, we need a progress bar. There we go. So this progress bar is going to be how far along we've actually started building. So we'll make it a bit smaller. It's not that important here. Center it 0.5 as well. And there. So let's make it a bit wider. We'll put it 140. And we can also just change the fill color to be our orange as well. Let's just see if that worked. There we go. So our progress bar is now there as well. Now we can also add extra things like a text box for the percentage in number, but that's a bit extra and it's not necessary because it's the same value anyway, just times 100. Then we want to, well, I think this will suffice. I don't think the rest is that useful. We already have the time in our select node here, so we don't really need to have it twice. I don't think it's necessary, so we'll just settle for this. So this will be progress bar underscore, well, crafting. I don't think there's much more to add than that. Next up is the actual inputs and outputs, which we need to see. So for these, we want to we'll do 2 canvas panels, or 1 at least, and then we'll copy it over. So this will be canvas panel. You don't need to rename this because it doesn't matter, but just so it's clear, this is the inputs. And the inputs will be at the same point, so 60 on the Y, I think that's the number. No, 80 on the Y. And then 320 here. And across, it will be 380. So we want to copy this, and we'll do the same thing next to it. And this is going to be outside, sorry. So this is going to be outputs instead. And output will be 0 and 80 as well. But this time we'll put it on the top right, and we'll say 1 and 0. And that should do the trick as well. There we go. So inside of these, we want to add an image, which will be the fill kind of. It's just that otherwise it's very difficult to tell what we're working on because of how visually it is. 0 and 0, so just fill both of these. They don't need to be a variable because we don't care what they are. Doesn't matter. Then what we need is this is the kind of important part. We need a vertical box. So inside both the input and the output, and I think we can just set them to fill, I believe, or no, we don't want them to be fill. We want them to be fill on the height, so the bottom left one right here. But we want them to be, I think we want 10 on both sides, so there's a bit of a margin on the top and on the bottom. And on the sides, that way it's just balanced out. But we want it to be 300 on the X. And so we'll copy this and also place it in the outputs. That way it's the exact same. And yeah, so sometimes when you delete something, it actually goes back to the main thing. So 10, 10, and 10 right here. And make sure to rename these to VB output and VB input. Otherwise, it won't be very clear. And we need to make sure they're variable because we need to actually input the items into this. So before we go and actually input items, we need to have the items that we need. So that's what we need to set up next. So for that, we need to have an entire new widget that we're going to have to make as well. And that's going to be called auto crafting item, I think. So it's going to resemble that a bit. So UMG right here, UMG auto crafting item. There we go. So fill that up and open it. So within here, we're going to start off with a size box. And for most cases, we're not going to change the size box. We want to override it to be 300 by 70. And so we can set that to desired now so that we get the size we want. Then want to add a canvas panel. And inside the canvas panel, the first thing we want to add is our UMG crafting item. And so this is actually the one that we have right here that we've used before. What we want to do with this is we want to make sure that this, so what we're going to use this for is inside of here, if I remember correctly, last time we made a variable read only and we didn't do anything with read only. Now, what read only is going to be for is inside of this, we actually want to be able to drop items on it to say that, well, hey, we want to use this from the inventory and place it there. Because here, we're not going to be using the inventory to set this value. We're going to be using the items in the input and output of the machine itself. So, but if we want to add items to the machine, then we can do that from our inventory. And that's how we'll do it. So what we need to do here is we need to modify our read-only to not be the case, but in general, so in our crafting here, we want it to be by default true. We're not going to use that. We'll get to that in a second, but for now, we'll just set it by default to true and uncheck it right here. So what we want this to be is top left. We want it to be 5, 5, and we want it to be 60 by 60. So this will pretty much fill up the entire thing. We don't need to change our slot size. It doesn't matter. And next, what we need is we need some text. We need to know what resource this is. And we want to also, this time we want to calculate how much it can make per minute or how much it consumes per minute. So that's going to be what we're going to add here. So first we want to add a text box. And this text box is going to be wrapped in a scale box because we need to make sure that it's not too big. So right here, we want to wrap with scale box. Now, just to make sure, we want the scale box to be offset by about, I think 60 will do. No, 80 I think is good. Maybe too much. 70 is perfect, I think. Yeah, 70 is good. And we want the scale box to be all the way to the end. We have no problem with it going all the way to the end, so we might as well do that, sorry. And make sure it's 0 right here. And within it, what we want is we want the text to be fill and centered. So we want it to be height centered. We're going to make it a bit grayish so it stands out, because obviously on the background now it's white. So we want it to be visible. And this will be something like, we need 3 iron ingots. That's what it will be. And it will consume what we're going to write below. We're simply going to add a text box here. Right here will do. We want it to be bottom here, but we want it to be 70 as well. And I think 1 on the Y, so then we can put it to 0 here. Now we want this one to be a bit smaller, so something like 16, and we want it to be light. No, I remember why. Oh well, it doesn't really matter. Okay, so what this is going to be is it's going to be time per minute. So this is the amount of items that are either crafted or required to craft per minute instead of the amount of seconds required. So we'll make this, I think we'll make it a bit orange so it stands out. And so now we can get into the actual one. Actually, first we need to change this to be variable. This is text box quantity, we'll call it. Or maybe no, time is probably better. This also needs to be text box item name. Sorry, item name. And with that, we can now get into the actual graph itself. So the first thing we need to do is we need to know what we're talking about. So we need a structure for our ST inventory type. So this is going to be, it's going to be very similar to what we have in our actual crafting item. So it's going to be pretty much these as well. We're going to need obviously our crafting quantity again. So once again, same system as before. And finally, we want this time the crafting duration. And this is going to be a float. Now all of these need to be exposed on spawn like this. Make sure we tick all of them. Here we go. And now with all of these, we can actually start setting things up. So what we want to do here is we want to know when a structure is modified as well. So for that, we want to call modified structure here. And I think it needs to be, yeah, it just needs to know what the new structure is. So this is our new structure. It's going to be ST inventory. And it's going to be used once we actually go about, and if we drag an item onto this, it needs to know that something's changed. And so what this will allow us to do is if we drag an item from the player, let's say inventory, into this point here. So let's say we drop it here, then that means that we can tell our building itself that those items have been added to its input or its output. So that's what this is for. Otherwise, we can't actually tell when the player adds an item manually. So specifically how this works is obviously the dropping is going to be in here. So we don't have that set up yet. So we're going to go and do that very, very quickly. If I just go and pull up to be sure. Yeah, so inside of our crafting item, we need an event dispatcher as well. And so this is going to be modified quantity. At least that's what we're going to call it. And that's exactly what it does. But it's going to take in the structure. So structure right here. And it's going to be ST inventory. So for now, we're going to come back to this in a second. We're just going to set it all up in here. So now if we go here, we have our new event that we just made. And it's going to call a function that we're going to create here as well, which is going to be called structure modified. And now we'll call our event dispatcher as well. But first, let's just get this bit done, and then we can do that. So the first thing we want to do is set this up visually. So from our structure here, we want to get our data asset. So we want to right click on the end, split, and we want to get our name here this time. But unlike before, we also want to know how much is used. So we want to get our crafting quantity here, not the duration. And with our text box item name, we want to say set text. We want to format the text, and we want to use quantity and name as 2 different points here, because we want to know how much we need to make this, how much of this item is needed in this crafting recipe. So make sure you put a space bar between, otherwise they'll be stuck together, which isn't that great. Next, we need to know what the actual consumption rate is per minute. So we want to set text here. And what we want to do is do a little bit of math. We want to get our actual current duration. We want to divide it, or we want to divide 60 by our current duration because the current duration is in seconds. We want to then multiply this by the quantity we need, or the quantity we are consuming. And then this will just snap it to a grid so that we can keep it at 0.1. Otherwise it gets a bit too large. So then we want to call the format as well. And this text will simply be the value per minute. Minutes. There we go. So if we plug that in, this should work just fine. There we go, just line it all up. And so the last thing we need to do, I'm not sure if this function exists with our crafting recipe. We want to say update basic appearance. We want to take our structure. We want to take our crafting quantity, and this will just make it visible on the actual item itself that we've set it up. So complete. And with this, let's just finish off by modifying our structure, which is very, very simple. If the structure is modified, we set the new structure. We get to call once again our update basic appearance, plug it in right here. And finally, we call our event dispatcher from here with our new structure. Like this, there we go. So compile and save. And now with this, we can set it up visually. So we already know what it looks like. So let's go ahead and call those in our actual crafting table. Not our crafting table, but our buildings right here. So to do that, we need to go into our new recipe selected, because this is where everything is going to happen. This is when we select our recipe, so we start changing everything. So one thing we need to do here is, actually we haven't set this up yet, but we'll get to it in a second. We want to create a variable for our actual recipe, because currently we only have the UMG. We want to know what data asset it is. So we want to get our data asset here from our UMG, and we want to promote this to being the new recipe. So promote this right here by saying promote to variable, make sure it's not local but an actual variable, and we'll call this our default recipe, or selected recipe is probably better. Selected recipe DA, so DA for data assets. So we'll put this in components for now, that's fine. Plug this all in, and what we want to do is we want to start off by getting our inputs and outputs, and want to clear the children from them, because we don't want to have any extra items than we don't need. So if we plug this all in, we can align it up, and there we go. So the next thing we want to do is we want to say that a recipe has been selected. So we want our all items here. Got something, we forgot a function in our all items, which is important. Sorry, so that's my bad. Back in our all items, we need to actually make a function, which I forgot. So back in our crafting table, we can actually, I think, copy the majority of it over. So I think what we're looking for is, we want to copy show relevant items. Paste show relevant items instead. There we go. And this will be a bit different, because currently it uses recipe selected. What we want to do is we want to, it uses DA items, which we can't actually use here. What we want to use is the actual recipe selected. So we're going to call this recipe selected, and it's going to be of type DA recipe. And we're going to check if it is valid, like this. And then we want to continue. If not, we want to tell our relevant items here to be cleared, and we want to simply return an empty node, or an empty return value. This goes into here. We can then actually remove that. We don't need it anymore. Just move it all to the side. So I like it when it's lined up there. And so here we no longer have an actual value, because that no longer exists, because it is get inventory. So we need to get our inventory from here. Same thing. And I think we have to go through, I believe it's in a few spots. Just double check. Well, currently, normally if we can compile, we'll see. So no errors. So that means we only need it right here. So one other thing we need to do is we need to actually modify our inputs because we want this, but we can't use that. So we need to turn it into a local variable, which we will be calling inputs. L inputs, plug it into isValid, and to get it very simply, we want to get recipe selected. And we don't have a function for this, but we're going to make one very quickly, which is just going to be a get relevant items, let's say. A manual one that we'll make. So I need a bit of space for this because it's not worth making it into a function. So right here, we want to get this, and we want to do a few for each loops. We're going to get inputs. We're going to do a for each loop through those right here. And what we want to do is we want to break this. We want to get our item data, and we're going to say inputs add unique item data. And we don't need the quantity, so we can hide that. We can then duplicate this by quite literally copy and pasting it here. And we just want to replace inputs with outputs. So outputs instead, plug this in, and now we have the same thing because it's still going to be the inputs, or at least this is the inputs. We can then reroute, plug it into here, and we are done with this. We just need to actually, sorry, we don't need that anymore because we've added them here. We just need to make sure that this input gets replaced with our local one instead. So we need to go through and find all our inputs here and replace them with the new one. So I don't think we have that many. I think that's the only one. But just to make sure, we'll scan through it very quickly. And I don't think so. So if we go and delete this right now, if we compile and save, we have no issues. So that means we know we've solved the issue. So now it's adapted. Now it does the relevant items as well with this function. So we can go back to our buildings here. And right here, we can now finally call that function, which is going to be called relevant, show relevant items. Or show relevant items. So what this does is we get our selected recipe. Well, actually, we can just simply get our DA instead directly. Plug this in, line these up. Then from here, we want to get our inputs right here for each loop. And we want to plug this in right here. And we're going to go through them and add them to our actual boxes. So here we get to break this. We get to create a widget. Create widget right here. And the widget we're looking for is our auto crafting item, which just like before, we get to split this right here. We want to put quantity here and item data here. We always want to leave this empty. And the selected recipe here we can use again. And this time we want to get duration. And that's going to be plugged in right here. Now this can be duplicated again because we're going to be using it also for outputs as well. But first, let's finish it off by getting our, I believe, our event modified structure and binding that to a new event we're going to make, I think. So let's create an event. And this event is going to be called, once I can actually modify it, there we go, input modified from widget, because we're going to be able to obviously modify them from the actual building itself. So we need to make sure that's taken into account as well. So then from here, we want to add this to our vertical box, and specifically we're looking for the input. So add child to vertical box, plug it in, and content right there. And now we can set it up what shape it's going to take. So set vertical alignment, and we want to make sure we center it. Then we also want to say set size and split the size to default. We can then copy this as a whole, and we just need to change it from input to output. So plug this in here, remove the inputs, put outputs like this, and then we want to leave this as it is, no problem. We just want to change our VB input to the output. So grab it from down here, drag it on, and that should replace it. Now here, we actually need a second one. And this is going to be the same thing, but instead of input, it is output modified. So we can compile and save and go back to our function right here. So this obviously remains the same, no difference there. Now we just need to do one last little thing. And that one last thing is just setting up the little visuals on the side. So that is, for instance, saying that our image here changes and this name here changes. So we want to get text box for recipe, I think name was it, or did we give it crafting icon we have, and text box recipe? I think so, yeah. So we want to set text here like this, and the text is going to be from our recipe. We will get name, simply plug that in right here like this, line those two up. And then the icon, we want to do the same thing. We want to set texture from, set brush from texture, sorry. And once again, we get our image, or sorry, we want to get our outputs this time. And we want to get a copy. And we're looking specifically for 0, once again. And get image. There we go. Plug this into here. And that should do the trick. Once now we select a recipe, we should get the information for what is used to craft it. So let's go and compile and save. And if we go and try and select iron, we have an iron ingot, 30 ohm made per minute, and 30 ohm consumed of iron ore per minute as well. So this checks out because we have 2 seconds to make the resource. So that means every 2 seconds, one is consumed. So that means half of that, half of 60. So 30 a minute. And let's just see if it works if we swap it to steel ingot. So the name changes here. We have the 2 instead. Same for the steel beam 4, but this is going to consume a lot more, but only produce a lot less because it consumes 4 per consumption. So everything seems to be working just fine. We can also check for our relevant items. If we go and select iron, we have our relevant items that appear here. If we select steel ingot, we have our coal as well. If we select steel beam, we have nothing because we don't have anything. Oh, well, but we do have some errors. So why is that? So where is this coming from? Sorry, so the reason for that is just because we call in our event construct. The same reason as why we made a late construct for the other one. It's because this isn't valid yet. So what we can do, just to be sure, is we can say is valid here, because either way we're going to be updating it right after anyway. So only do this if it's valid, then we don't get the error anymore. So next, what we want to do is we want to actually do the actual drag and drop, because currently if we go and let's say pick up iron, select iron, we can't actually do anything with this. We can't drag this onto it. It doesn't really work, or at least it does, but it's not actually working because currently the item comes back. It's just visually bugs, but we don't want that. We want it to go into here and add itself to the quantity. So now what we can do is we can start the dragging and dropping system, let's say. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that when we pick up an item, we can actually move it. So we want to be able to do it obviously in both ways. Currently we can already move from our inventory. Now we just want to be able to move the other way. So we're looking for an override for mouse button down. And what we want to check is 2 things. 1, are there any items? And 2, if it's read only. So if it's read only, not, and more like, we have enough quantity from our structure here, we want to split and say if you are superior to 0, then we can do something. Otherwise, we want to return that this has been handled. So we can leave this right here. Let's just move this a bit along. There we go. Now, on the other hand, we also want to check which key it was. So we want to get our mouse event, and we want to look for the effecting button. And this is just pretty much to check which key it is. So we'll double equal. If it is left click, then we take it into account. Otherwise, we just ignore it. So plug this in like this. And we'll just actually copy this much easier and paste it here. On the other hand, if we do select the right value, what we want to say is, once again with our mouse event, we want to look to be a drag and drop. So we will detect drag if pressed. So this is going to be the left click as well. Plug this in, and there we go. So now with this, we can actually call on drag and drop operations. So what we want is on drag detected, right here. And on drag detected, we want to do most of the logic for creating it. So we're going to create a widget. And this widget is going to be a crafting item. So right here, I believe. Yep, that one will do. And we then want to say create a drag and drop operation, which is going to be plugged into the end here. And our return value here is the visual, so the default drag visual, and the payload is self. We always want to make sure we reference self here, so that way we can delete the old one if something happens. We then want to split our structure again, and we want to get our structure here, and we want to invert these two. So what we want to do is we want to detect on drop. So on drop here, have it right there. We want to do the logic for what happens when an item. First, we want to see our read only, and we want to check that we are not reading. So not boolean here, and we want to do a branch. Now, if we are not read only, meaning that we are read only and we don't want to do anything, we want to return empty, meaning we failed. Now, on the other hand, what we want to do is with our structure here, we want to split, and this is going to be used to get our quantity. So this is going to be our start quantity because we're adding items to it. So if there's not enough space, you need to handle that. So here we can also get max stack, and this will be our max quantity. So L max quantity. Plug this in right here. And now what we can do is we want to get our operations, or our operation, sorry. We want to get our drag visual, and depending on what it is, so in our case, we want to cast to UMG item. And the reason for this is because the reason we're not actually going to be checking, so what happens here, sorry, is we return false. And the reason we're only checking for UMG item is because normally, if we were to select an item in here, let's say stealing it, and we were to try and drag iron ore to coal, that shouldn't be possible. Normally, an input and an output should never be the same. You should never have iron coming in and iron coming out. If we have iron here, it can only be dropped here again. So either way, we just want to say, well, we don't want to check whether this is what we're dragging. So we just ignore that. So that way, all we want to do is see if items come from outside. So what we'll do here is we'll say get quantity, and we'll promote this to being the quantity in. So quantity in. And then get to plug this right here. And we don't need this anymore. We already have enough of those. And what we want to check is we want to check if our max stack right here, so our max quantity minus our start quantity, meaning how much we have extra space. If this minus, or more like our quantity in minus that, is superior to 0, then it means we have too much. It means we need to get rid of some of it somewhere. Yeah, sorry, no. So what we do then, this means on true that we have more items than we can actually put in this location. And remember, this is dropping into the actual crafting building itself, assembler or whatever it is. So there can only be so much. There is no second inventory slot or anything like that, and that can't happen. So in that case, what we need to do is we get our operations. Get operation. We want to get the payload, and the payload being our original self. And we're going to say cast to UMG, to UMG item. Go right here. And we're going to say update quantity. Sorry, no, this is not the crafting thing in the building. This is updating the previous one. And here we're going to modify our structure quantity to our actual new one. So our max stack, because we've just maxed it out. So max quantity, sorry. And then we get to return obviously true because we handled this situation. Now the value that goes into here is pretty much the calculation that we did right here. So we can copy that and simply plug it in here. On the other hand, if that doesn't happen, we use this as well. And this time we won't be updating, we'll be simply removing, because we know that that's been 100% consumed and there's nothing left. So then we call from here our modify as well, and our return being true as well, obviously. And this time we want to simply do start quantity and quantity in added together. So we'll just replace you with quantity in, simple addition, and plug it in like this. There we go. So compile and save, and that should do it for dragging and dropping. So normally, if everything's gone well, if we select iron ore and we select iron ingot and we drop this in here, it should have added it to it. So sorry, so the reason that is because inside of our auto crafting, I left the actual reference to the crafting item checked, so it was read only, so we couldn't actually do anything. So next one we need to do, so if we go in here and select our iron ingot and we drag this 80 here to it, it becomes 80 out of 1, knowing that it has enough to craft. But currently it's not doing anything because we haven't told it to transfer this to the building itself. So if we close it and press tab, our items are gone because they've been removed, but it's not being saved or anything, so that's what we need to do now. So that we can drag and drop items across. Now we just need to make it so that they actually communicate, let's say. Okay, so one other thing we can actually do very, very quickly, which is rather simple. Back in our main crafting widget, if we get a reference to our actual, I think it's our all items right here, we have our inventory modified, which we can call here and get a reference to it itself and say recipe, selected, no, that's not what I call it. It is relevant, show relevant items. And with our selected recipe here, we can actually update it. So before, when we selected our actual item here, if I remember well, if we go and select our iron ingot here and we drag 60 here, it would keep the 60 there, but now it updates because it knows that it's been moved. So that's a little thing out of the way. So now we can actually get to the main kind of topic. So that's actually crafting the items themselves. So the main logic, we've actually already done most of it, and most of it actually already takes place here. So we're just going to be actually setting up a system to communicate between the two. So most of that is already done here with our actual modified here. But the thing is, we haven't told it what to do with that information. So we don't need our crafting table anymore. I don't think we'll need all items either. Crafting item is done as well. Auto crafting as well. We don't need that at all. These are recipes. So these are the main two we're going to be working with now. So the first thing I want to actually do first is currently we already have a recipe, a setup recipe. That's what we use. So what we want to actually tell it first is, well, if we start the level, right? If we start and select an item, we already have a recipe selected. We don't want to have to select every time and reset it. So we want to inform it that we already have that recipe. So to do that, what we want to do is we're going to get our building reference, get our building, and we're going to get our crafting recipe. And we're going to set that to our selected recipe. Now, what this means is, well, we already have a recipe selected. We can do something with that. Now, what we can do is inside of here, we can check what that recipe is, and if it is identical to another one, how we should handle it. So once we go through all our recipes here, we can reroute this, and we can say, well, if this is double equal to our recipe selected, so our DA, make sure you select the DA one, then if that's the case, we want to say that we can select that recipe directly by saying new recipe selected. And obviously we need to select this one, won't work, but we can select this right here because we know what it is and it will highlight it for us. So by default, I'm not sure if that's the case, so let's just double check. By default, we do not have a recipe, I don't think. So let's just see. We have crafting recipe, no, so we don't have one. So let's just, for testing sake, we'll select steel beam here. And we will go and connect to this, and it should already be here. So it's on a recipe. It's not the right recipe though. It should have been on this steel beam recipe. The reason it didn't do that is because we already have it exposed here and it's like signing it itself. So it is correct. It is working correctly. If we change it here to steel ingot, it should work just fine with steel ingots. There we go. So sorry, it was working just fine. There was no problem whatsoever. So with this, we now have a system where if we go and select an item, it will, or at least if there's already an item selected here, it'll already set it up here once we open the widget. So now what we need to do is we need to tell it, well, if we select an item, tell the building that we've changed the actual selection. So we have our function for that. And we just need to go ahead and inform it to actually update. So for that, we already have our recipe selected right here. So we just need to go and tell it in our building that that's the case. So in our here, right here, where we select, we have our change recipe. And normally this already does this. So let's try and see if that works. If I go and select already by default with steel ingot, if I select iron ingot and I close it, it still opens back on iron ingot. And if we go to recipe, it's not selected though. Okay, so very quickly inside of our auto recipe, so the recipe auto one, we want to make a quick function here, right here. So we're going to collapse this to a function, which we'll call select, and just simply plug it back here. And it's just so that inside of our main one in our craft here, when we select a new recipe right here, we can tell this specific recipe to select itself so that it appears visually that it has been selected. So now if we go and into here, we already have a recipe selected. If I close it and open it, it still knows that that's the one that's selected for us. So that's what that's for. So we just go here. Okay. So next what we want to do is we want to modify our inputs. So if the input's modified from widget, there's very few things we need to do. What we need to do is we need a reference to our building. And we want to say input map modify. So I'm just going to check because I made some modifications. So we're actually going to make those as well. So first, let's just add this here. So modify input map, very simple. We want to get the key. Now, if the key is invalid, we'll handle that in a second because currently we don't have a key here. There's no way to know the key. So we want to get the structure, plug that in here very simply. And right here, we want to call from our all items again that our recipe, that our relevant items have changed. So we want to get our recipe once again and plug this in. So this will just update visually which ones have changed because the modified might be from that. So this will give us an error. And the reason it gives us an error is because by default, our key here is passed by. And we don't want it to be passed by. We just want it to be a reference to the attach point itself. So we're then going to modify this. And what we'll do is we'll get our key. We're going to get our value. And what we'll do is if our get key here, so actually we'll just copy it, is not valid. So we want to do this as a sequence, sorry. So start with the sequence. If our key is valid, then we want to do this. If not, then we're going to handle it a bit differently. We're going to go through and actually find which one it is. So what we have to do is we get our inputs, we do a for each loop, and obviously the for each loop is going to be on the keys because the keys is the only way we can actually find an item, so we have to do it this way. So we go through and we look whether we can find in our inputs the item. So we split right here. Now, obviously, we don't need to check here because we're going through the same array. And so we check if this is double equal to our structure, our value, sorry, that just came in, and check whether the item data is the same. And if it is, that means we found the item. And actually, this should be a for each loop with break. That's my bad. So for each loop with break, sorry. And if we find the item, we'll obviously stop the break. So plug this back in here. And instead, we put our add here because now we actually found it. So we plug in our key right here. And we can go all the way back around to our break and just add a few reroutes just so it's more readable. There we go. So then we can do our second node. And so our second node is a branch, or it starts with a branch, and we look for can craft. There we go. And so can craft, what we want to do is we want to get our timeline for crafting and check if it's playing. Because if we can craft and it is playing, we don't want to do anything. If we can craft and we are not crafting, meaning it's not happening, we want to say resume crafting. We want to start again. Now, on the other hand, if we cannot craft and we are crafting, we need to say stop crafting, because we no longer have the items required because we removed them manually. The player removed them manually, more like. So next we need to do the same thing, but for the outputs. So now we can compile. There's no longer an error because it's no longer a pass by value. So in our output widget modified, we pretty much do the exact same thing. So we can just copy this in here. Obviously, we're not going to be using our input map. It doesn't work, but I don't think we have an output map modified. So we need to go and make that. So in here, we're just going to go ahead and actually duplicate this. So get it up in our functions. I think it's here, or is it crafting? It's in crafting. So we want to look for modify input map, duplicate it, and we'll change it to modify output map. And this isn't going to be correct for now. We're going to come back to it in a second. We just want to call it from here, output or output, modify output map, attach the value, plug these both in, align this up, and there we go. So output map modified is pretty much, I think, the same thing. We just want to change, obviously, our output here. And same thing here, output instead. We don't need to check anything different. It just works the exact same way. So you can close most of these. We'll just get through to them one by one. So one other thing we need to do, and this is kind of the other way around. We need to know whether we are modifying information, whether how to put it? Right now we check whether the items get changed from within the widget and inform the actual crafting system. So normally, if everything is correct right now, so let's actually test that. If we add an output here, currently nothing comes out because there's nothing in the item. But if we pick up some iron ore here and select the recipe of iron ore and place that in here, it should begin to actually craft items normally. So apparently it isn't. So we'll go through it and see why that is. So in new recipe selected, these should be bound input. So that might be why. This should be output. I forgot to change that, which is not good. Okay, yes, so that's my fault. That's entirely my fault. In the modify value here, modify quantity structure, we actually need to tell it to call this. Otherwise, it's useless. We don't actually use it. So plug that in here. And now everything should work back down the line correctly. So we don't need to see this anymore. No more prints there. And everything should function if we go and double check. So now if I do that test again, if we plug this in here, no outputs, but if we pick up some iron ore and drop it in the recipe for iron ore, we should start to get outputs. Still not for some reason. So okay, so the reason it's not crafting is because I made a mistake, or at least we hadn't actually modified something in the change crafting recipe, because up until now, the only thing that would change was the output. We weren't telling it what the inputs were. So we need to actually do that now so that we know which kind of inputs are used for the crafting, because currently it's not actually finding the item because it doesn't know what items it can take in. So we need to update that. The reason is that, but because here we're trying to find and check an item data that doesn't exist, because this is invalid. By default, we leave it empty in the event begin play because we don't know what it is. So here in our change crafting, we need to actually inform it of all this. So let's get into it. So most of the stuff will happen after this. We keep the outputs. I think the outputs don't need any changing. They work just fine. So actually, we'll just leave that how it is. We will copy, I think, the majority of it actually. So we'll just go and copy paste this as a whole. Drag it all. And this goes into completed, but instead it's going to be for the inputs. So right click, swap this over to inputs. Here we do the same thing. Here we need to change this from outputs to inputs. So get that right there. Get inputs, plug this in as well. Quantity always left to 0 because there's no items by default in there. And finally, also one other thing we can do, although it's not that important, if you want, when you do this, you can also check whether there's any items already in there and pick them up from the player. So use our pickup item function. That's if you want an extra little thing that can be necessary. So with this, normally it should be working. For the third time I say this, it hopefully does. If we go and put an output here and we swap the recipe to iron ore, I drop iron ore in, it works. So we start crafting every 2 seconds now, and it's going to keep consuming. If I open it again, this doesn't work because it doesn't inform the widget what it is. So why did it just only make 5? It's very strange. Oh, sorry. So I know why. So the reason is because once we opened it again, we set it back to 0, which is not correct. So we need to do the other way, well, share the information the other way now, and that will fix it. So we should no longer need this. We should no longer need that. We should just be with these two from now on. So let's close those. They work. This is also done. We don't need to modify that. Now we're going to need a few more functions now here and there. So let's get into those. So the first thing we want to do is we're going to make a function called update crafting values. And what this is going to do, very simply, it's going to get the information from our actual building and say, well, hey, we have this amount of information. This is what we're going to store visually as well. So we can make 2 macros for this. We'll call get build inputs. And this is going to be from our buildings. We're going to get our inputs and we're going to drag this out right here. We then duplicate it and this will be outputs instead. So just replace this with our outputs. There we go. And we've got our 2 very short macros. So from here, we get our inputs, we get our values, and we do a for each loop. Now the for each loop this time, we want to reroute this because we're going to need it a bit on the side. And we need to get our VB inputs, so our inputs that are actually visual. We want to get all children, and we're going to for each loop through them and inform them which ones need to be handled by which of the inputs. So we can get our auto crafting here with a cast. And we want to get our structure, which we're then going to break and check whether this item right here is the same. So we can break it. We'll just put a reroute as well. And so we just want to check whether these 2 are equal. If they are, then that means that we have the same item and we can update it. So we will call from here, sorry, from this one here, modify or structure modified on true. And the value is this, our input that's coming from our build. So we can just add another reroute here just to make sure. We can then do the exact same thing for the outputs. So just copy this below and plug it in right here. So just detach that, get the outputs instead. And actually, to be fair, I should probably rename that. Doesn't make much sense. Outputs. There we go. So compile and save, and this will update. Actually, no, sorry, we need to change that as well from input to output. Is there anything else? Just to make sure. No, we're good. So that does it for updating crafting. We just need to now place that in a few locations to do that. So let me just check. So we want to call this in our new recipe selected. So we're going to call it right at the end, update crafting values. So we're going to make also another function. And this is just part of where this is going to go, which we're going to be calling just is simply going to be finished crafting. Now we're not going to put anything in finished crafting other than the update value. But this way, if ever you want to do something specifically on finish, like play a particle effect, play a sound effect, then you can just place it in here. This is where it'll be called once an item has been crafted. Next, it needs to also be in some other things, which are item inputted and outputted, which we're going to be calling from outside. So this is item inputted to build. And this is going to be, oh, sorry, not the whole thing. We just want that. And we're going to do the same thing for item outputted from build. So right here, outputted. And so these are kind of useless on their own now, but we're going to make it so that we're going to call them from outside. So we also want to do another very quick one as well. And we're then going to move back to our main thing. So this is going to be called update crafting progress. And it's going to take in a simple %, which is going to be a float. So plug that in here. And we're going to, well, get our progress bar. So for crafting, and say set % right here, plug this in, and that'll update our actual progress bar. So compile and save. And I think that's most of the functions, if I'm not wrong. So that should be all the functions we need inside of this widget. So now we just need to go back to our 8 buildings and actually go through all of this. So there's a few modifications we're gonna have to make as we go through. So we're gonna start with our actual begin plate. So on begin plate, we no longer need this because now we can actually select. We can also actually make sure our crafting recipe is no longer instance editable. It's not necessary. We're going to be selecting it ourselves. So we can set this to clear for now. So the next thing we want to do is now we finally get to do something on update. So on update, we want to get our UMG for the building. We want to check if it's valid. And if it is, then we want to say update progress bar. So crafting progress, and plug in the alpha right there. And if I remember correctly, we did 0 to 1, so that will work just fine. Next, what we want to do is also on the same kind of line of thought here. If we go back here, so we're going to add a sequence here just to make things a bit tidier. The first thing we'll do is we'll consume the inputs right here. And on the end, we'll do the crafting to start again if we can, like this. That way it's very clear. And so here what we'll do is we will tell it to check whether we've actually managed to finish. So if we finished and our widget is open, we want to inform it that it is finished. So here, finished crafting. And so that will update the values if it needs to. Make sure you put this also at the end because we're modifying the inputs here. So we'll be updating it only at the end. So input from attach point. Here we're going to have to make a slight modification. I believe it is right here. So if I remember well, I think there was a comment saying that there was a bit of an issue. And so that was fixed by this, but we can actually expand on that and make it a bit better. So the first thing we want to do is just move this a bit further. And what we'll do is we will sequence for this. So the first thing we want to do is just make sure this happens. And then what we want to do, is we want to do something a bit different here because we're going to add some stuff as we go. First thing we want to destroy is the input item because the input item comes in, we can get rid of it. Then we want to update our image. So is our UMG, are we looking at the UMG? Yes, if we are, we need to tell it that we just inputted an item. So inputted to build. So item was just inputted. We then want to reroute these just so that it goes back together. And then what we want to do is we want to say can output an item. And if we can, then we want to start outputting like this. Go. And we can then return true in both cases, either way, because we succeeded. It's just that we can start outputting in the case if we can. Now we no longer need obviously our crafting because we do that inside of our modify input map. So we can get rid of all that and that'll do it here. We need to do the same thing on the output as well. So output from attach point if I'm correct. So yeah, so in output from attach point, so in our output category, output from attach point right here, right before the end, we just want to get once again our here. And this time, obviously because they're doing the same thing, it doesn't matter, but we want to use the outputted item from build. And normally with this, we should be done. If we go and play now, everything should be updating correctly. If we select some iron ore here and we just go and place it like this, we have a progress bar. It's going to be able to craft because it has items to craft. It's updating, it's going down. If we go and add an output here, it should output 3 in one go because 3 of them are already made. But now the rest will start slowing down as it starts to actually craft as it exports. So now it's not going to be able to output anymore, so it will stay here. So something is still wrong, because we don't have -1 obviously, and we had more than that to craft. So we need to figure out why that is. What's happening is we're going into the crafting recipe and we're saying it's valid. So we change the crafting recipe and automatically tell it to reset everything. But the thing is, if we already have the same crafting recipe, we don't want to do that. That's not necessary. We want to just keep going. So what we'll do is we will modify this ever so slightly. Let's just move this down. What we want to check is we want to get our crafting recipe here. And we want to get another one here and rename this to crafting recipe in, because we need to be able to tell the difference. So get crafting recipe in. And unless these two are different, so if they're different, then we want to update it. Otherwise, we don't want to do anything. Because if they're the same, we just want to keep going. We want it to keep crafting or keep doing whatever it was doing, because it doesn't matter. So we can just let it do exactly this. So now we just need to modify this by crafting recipe in. Let's just check that we don't have any errors. Yeah, so we need to modify this because it's using the one we have. So crafting, actually no, we do need to put crafting recipe in. We need to be using this one and not the actual glow on the main variable. We need to be using the local one. So just plug this in here instead. And that should solve the issue. There we go. So if we go and play now, we shouldn't have that issue anymore. Let's just try, give it a bit of space, select iron, drag and drop. We have 80. If we close it and open it again, we still have 80. It goes down, values change, it outputs. It's not showing anything here because it immediately can output it. So there's nothing to worry about there. One thing we do need to set up, which currently doesn't work, is the fact that if we try and input more items and it can't take anymore, it won't be able to, or it will be able to handle that. It's just that it won't be able to re-let them input. So we need to add a small modification for that. So to achieve that, what I decided to do is inside of our inputs, we're going to add something. We're going to add something called attempted inputs. And that's going to be of type A attach point. And it's going to be of type item in a map. And the reason for this is that if we have it set up this way, we're going to store in an attach point which item is trying to enter. And if it can enter or it can't, then it gets stored here. Sorry, if it can't enter, it gets stored there and waits. And if it can, then it's removed from that list. And if ever there's a block, it will stop and remember which one is trying to enter so that it can restart. So to do that, we need to go and, well, set that variable up. So I'm just going to get all my references for it. And what we want to do is very simple. We want to look for input from attach point. If we cannot input from attach point, that's fine. We don't mind. We just want to get the attach point, get our attached input, and say add the item. So in this case, we just want to get our input item, plug it in here. And obviously they will override themselves because that's how the attach works. The add works in the map. It just replaces the old value or the old key. And because there can only be a key for each attach point, there's no problem there. So we then want to get this in our change crafting recipe because that's where something can happen. If we change the crafting recipe, then all of a sudden we might be able to take that item in. So we need to check here whether we can do exactly that. So for each loop, we check whether we can find this within our inputs. And what we want to do is we want to get our structure. I think that's what we called it. Yeah, we call it structure. We want to split that and plug it in here, and we will check whether we can input item. Because now we just get to check if we can. So we check again. If we can, then we actually input. So we go here and say restart movement. Because the restart movement will let us know that, well, it can actually be inputted, so we don't have to worry with another function or anything like that. Now, one thing we can check first with this list is if the player picked the item up in between, then we need to check if it is valid, just in case. So here we go, is valid, and if it can input, we can do that. Now I'm just going to check that we didn't make any I didn't make any modifications inside of here, just in case, because there might be some, and just to be sure. So to test that, what we can do is we're going to move most of these to the side, just because Visual's in the way. Inside of our storage here, we're going to add an element of type iron ore, and we're going to make it something like, well, we'll put 80 so that there's always some coming out. I'm going to pick up some iron ore here, and I'm going to plug this into here. And normally, because we haven't selected a recipe, it shouldn't be allowed to go in, if all is well, and I hope it does stop. It's not stopping. That's not good. So that's not correct, because it is not supposed to be inputting an item, because it can't actually craft. So as you can see, it's not outputting, meaning it's letting them in, but it doesn't know, or at least it shouldn't be letting them in. So let's see and if we can figure out why that is. So the reason is because we're treating this right here. The reason this works is because it's saying you can input if there's no crafting recipe, which is partially true in the case where we have a container, but we're not talking about a container here, so the main one shouldn't allow this. So that's kind of an mistake on my part, because this isn't sustainable in the long term, because you need to either override this function to input with well, to be fair, it's not very difficult, because in most cases, as long as the inventory is full, you can input an item for a container. So make sure you check this to false, and that should fix our issue. So right now, if we go and try and import an item, it shouldn't be allowed because there is no recipe now. So let's double check. This should be working properly now. There we go. So it does indeed get blocked. Now, the other issue is, in that case, we'll have the same issue as here. So if I remember, no, so that's fine. Then we'll go through our input, and it will say, well, we attempted to put this one in. It didn't work. So let's try and see now if we do the same thing here. We'll let it get to the end. And once it gets to the end, we'll select our recipe, and it should start inputting it correctly. So it blocks. If I select iron, it lets it in, and it lets all the rest in, because it knows that that is allowed. And it seems to be having issues where it's stopping the instant something tries to come in. So that's the crafting getting paused. So we'll have to fix that. Actually, I don't believe this is necessary anymore, and we don't need that. So we'll just plug this in directly and see if that fixes the issue. I think that will. So let's plug it in, try again with our nodes. And so now normally it should just go in, and it shouldn't pause it every time. Yeah, so now we're no longer in the pause. It's all crafting as it spawns in. It's not pausing or anything. It's working just fine. If we close and open it again, it works as well. If we add an output, it'll start outputting as well. No problem. And the quantity is getting modified here normally as well as it goes out. It's outputting 1 a second, but crafting 1 every 2. So that's why the numbers aren't going perfectly well. It's blocked at the end. So the numbers keep going up, keeps producing. Now, one thing to test is if we go and pick up this iron ore and we drag 80 and put that here, it'll start slowing down normally, because now it shouldn't have the space anymore to keep going. So it should normally restart. So if we pick that one up, it will go back in, but it should normally know which one is next and restart it once it has the space. So yeah, so normally it should have restarted there. So let's try and figure out why it's not restarting. So this is good now, we don't need that. So what we need to check is if we modify. So let me just double check, because what we're looking for is attempted. This is what the attempted inputs are for. So normally our attempted inputs are in the change. No, so we don't want them just to be in the change crafting. We also want this to be on the in the event graph right here where we start crafting. We also want to check, so I think it's in consume input items, yeah. So on consume input items, we want to actually check at the end whether there's actually any space to import again, if we can start again, sorry. So we just copy that, paste it in here like this. And normally this should check. So once we're done with our inputs, sorry, not this one actually, we need to check at the end of that one. What it will do is it will check whether we have any extra inputs that can come in now, because we have that extra bit of space. So let's go ahead and try that. I'll pick up some iron ore, place it in, select iron ore as a recipe, and I will plug 100 once we actually start having some input. So I'm going to drop 100 in here, and it's blocking, but it's going once it can. So it will always stop because we only craft one every 2 seconds, and we consume less. So we have more that's coming in. So that's why it's stopping, and every time it can keep going, it goes again. So I think that does it. I think that's everything we want for this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed. I hope it gave you everything you wanted for an automated crafting system, mainly with the interface, because we had already done an automated crafting before. I think the next part is going to be on, I'm kind of hesitating, but I think it will be a rather shorter one. It's going to be on making the resource veins and the ability to mine those resources veins, be it automatically or with an item or by the player pressing E and interacting with it, because that's kind of the only thing that's missing to be able to fully automate this system. And after that, because some people have asked, it will probably be the electricity system, as currently we don't need any power for any of this to run, and the power is a slightly different system than the rest. So I thought, why not add it for kind of the last part of the series, I think. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next part. Goodbye.